Hi, welcome to this video. I'm Ian Allinson. I'm currently fighting Victimised Unite activist and last year stood for a Unite General Secretary. I'm going to be talking about union rank and file politics, what we mean by that and why that's so important, and particularly in the light of the recent overturning of the shoddy deal that was being offered in the universities strike led by UCU, the University and Colleges Union. But it's a general picture that whenever workers fight back, it throws up questions about the behaviour of the people at the top of the unions. Often members are frustrated by that behaviour and how we best respond to it. So this isn't an attempt to dig into the UCU, the universities dispute in particular, but to look in more general terms at the reasons why you get those conflicts within unions and how the different ways that workers have tried to organise to ensure that their interests prevail. It's important to put any argument about conflict within unions in context. The most important divide in society is between workers and employers. And this isn't just about bad employers. This is structured into the employment contract. The only reason employers employ us is if they can make a profit out of us, and collectively we're paid less than the value we create. Now, of course, there are workers in the public sector where, and in the third sector as well, where there isn't directly profit being made, but the same basic principle applies. It's where it's serving the interests of the employers and contributing to that overall structure of society where exploitation of workers is at the heart of it. The employment contract is also intrinsically unequal. It gives one party power over the other. Managers can issue reasonable instructions to workers and discipline or dismiss you if you fail to follow them. If you try doing that to your boss, you tend to find out that that's a one-way traffic. And similarly, it's a lot easier for employers to vary employment contracts than it is for workers to do so. Again, try giving your employer notice that you're varying the contract to increase your salary and just see how well that works. And then perhaps slightly more technical in the jargon, the employment contract is described as indeterminate, so it can't specify how much work or the quality of the work that the employer gets. So it's unlike other contracts in that respect. So what they're paying for is your capacity to work for a certain period of time, not the actual work you do. And that leads to fairly constant friction, sometimes greater, sometimes lesser, over the shifting, what people call the wage effort bargain, how hard you work for what money. So that division is the most fundamental one. And whenever we're talking about conflict within the union, it's really important to keep that in perspective. Unions themselves are contradictory beasts. So before workers set up unions, workers had attempted to address power imbalances by acting collectively. That's a basic thing. Wherever you see wage labour, workers start to try and act collectively to a greater or lesser extent, and one of the forms that takes that's particularly important is through strikes, collective withdrawal of labour. But of course, employers try and resist workers' power and strikes in particular. Employers often used to, and still do occasionally, lock out workers, dismiss workers, victimise workers who organise. And workers found that in order to win, they needed to build up strike funds so they could sustain action for longer periods. They needed to build up permanent organisations to administer those strike funds, and that's the origins of unions most fundamentally. So in that sense, you can think of unions as organisations of resistance to capital. That's their that's their origin. But once unions are established, they often then engage in what's called collective bargaining, reaching collective agreements with employers effectively about the terms of our exploitation, not whether we're exploited, but how much less than the value we create we're paid, how hard we're driven to work, and so on. And whenever we bargain with an employer, we are in a sense accommodating to capital. We're reaching an accommodation, an agreement with capital about the terms of our exploitation. And it's important to recognise when we're talking about unions that the balance between those two things varies, and there's a whole range of different factors that influence that. So you will see, if you're in a fairly hostile industry with relatively little union organisation, then the level of accommodation to the employer is very low, because there's very little opportunity to reach accommodations with employers. If you're in a very established industry where maybe the employer's under threat from competition from somewhere around the world, you've got well-established high union density and so on, it can be quite easy for unions to get drawn into a focus on accommodation and deals with the employer rather than resisting them. But there's a whole range of factors that influence that. So the same union can have different balance in different workplaces, in different sectors, or even in different activities that it's doing. So bargaining and organising pull unions in different directions in that spectrum. So looking in more detail at collective bargaining, the people who are engaged in that, the bargaining team, if you like, the negotiators, have to put themselves in the heads of their employer counterparts in order to be effective. So they have to learn to see things from the employer's perspective in order to try and work out how to bargain and how to put the case forward effectively. So they inevitably start to see things as well as from workers' perspective, from the employer's perspective as well. And of course, negotiation is stressful, it requires effort, and if you're locked in a room trying to thrash out a deal for days on end, of course there's pressure to get a settlement of some kind that isn't shared by the people who are not in the room, who are primarily interested in the content of any settlement rather than just the fact of a settlement. A final factor that I would highlight is that because the worker-employer relationship is an ongoing one, it's not a one-off bargain. It's not like buying something off eBay. You have an ongoing relationship within capitalism between workers and employers. And so there's pressure on negotiators to make concessions on substantive issues, pay, jobs, pensions, whatever it might be, in order to protect ongoing relationships with their counterparts, which have value for future negotiations. So that also tends to lead negotiators to take a different view of the relationship to the people they represent. When you then look at the role of union officers, that's, I would argue, slightly different again. So many negotiations are conducted by workers themselves in their role as reps, or the other words people use for them, things like stewards or fathers of chapel or mothers of chapel and so on. But as unions became larger and more permanent, it was impossible to run them simply on a volunteer basis. They had to start employing people at the very least to administer the union, maintain communications across a larger membership, maybe geographically dispersed, where it was impossible for people who were working full-time to be able to travel and conduct the business of the union on behalf of members effectively. So when we talk about union officers, we're not talking just about anybody employed by the union, but the people who are involved in that bargaining process that I just talked about. And unlike reps, officers are not directly affected by the outcome of the negotiations because they're not in the workplace themselves. They're much less exposed to pressure from and accountability to members. So somebody once said to me that the difference between a rep and an officer is if as a rep you do something wrong in a negotiation, your colleagues can spit in your tea. And while that's joking, it kind of makes the point that there's formal and informal pressure and accountability to workers that's there for reps that simply isn't there for officers. And that mediating between workers and employees is at the heart of the full-time officer's role. So in effect, they're neither one nor the other, whatever their origins. Most officers used to be workers, they used to be union activists, that's their background, that's they've taken on that role because of a commitment to trade unionism. But in their role, they are neither one nor the other. They're playing that mediating role between the two. Another key issue is what we're talking about when we talk about the union. So you'll often hear people talk about, the members are the union, and of course, in one sense, that's true. But the union is also an institution. And once workers had built permanent union organisation, of course, workers have an interest in building and defending it and so on. But for workers, the union remains a means to an end. The purpose of the union is to deliver improvements in their lives of various kinds. And different workers will have different views about the scope of that purpose and the nature of it. Is it just restricted to the workplace? What sorts of issues does it take up? But it will still be as a means to an end. But as people get more involved in the union, whether as activists or even more so as people who work for unions are employed by them, that view can become reversed. So instead of seeing union organisation as a means to improve workers' lives, campaigns to improve workers' lives become seen as a means to an end of increasing membership and improving the financial position, the influence and the status of the union as an institution. And that can become a dominant view amongst that layer of people who are employed by the union, and particularly those involved in bargaining. On top of which, any conflict includes risk. It includes risk of defeat, and obviously the consequences for individual workers are much more severe typically. We can lose our jobs, we can be victimised, we can be blacklisted, and so on. But for the full-time official, they are thinking about some different risks, the consequences of defeat, costs to the union of defeat, and so on. And in general, union officers tend to be more risk averse and cautious than workers because of that focus on the union as an institution. And that's magnified by the fact they're more remote and so less able to judge the mood. And it's interesting, since the 1980s, anti-union legislation brought in under the Tories and kept by New Labour exploited that relationship. So instead of, as in the 1970s, some anti-union legislation had focused on threatening workers with jail for their activities, in the 1980s onwards, it focused on threatening sequestration, fines, attacks on the union's funds and resources, and then relying on the people employed by the union officers to effectively police members and ensure they behaved in the way that the employers and the law required. There are other pressures on officers as well. And they're not all the same. So clearly somebody at the head of the union is under greater pressures from the establishment, from the employers and from the state and so on, than somebody in the lowest ranks of the union structure. And one factor in that is the fact that officers are often on salaries more like the managers they deal with than the members they represent. And when you hear people unhappy about the behaviour of certain union officers, this is often the central focus. They focus on, their pay packages. The fact the right-wing media often pick up on this is a factor too. But clearly, I would argue it's not the main factor, but it certainly does make officers more remote from the members, not sharing so much of their experiences. Probably a bigger factor is that officers, particularly at senior levels, spend a huge amount of time with employers, politicians and state functionaries, and you can't avoid being influenced by the people you spend your time with. Officers can also get frustrated with members' lack of understanding of the issues they spend their lives dealing with. So it's quite often, I think in any job you hear of people blaming the customer. In IT, people blame the user, and for union officers, blaming the members is a very common feeling with that frustration, and you can see where that comes from to some extent. And of course, whenever members want to resist capital rather than accommodating to it, when there's a desire to fight back, this inevitably means extra work for officers. So it creates pressure, particularly where officers already feel overworked, to push for a quick resolution rather than the best one. Their stake is in getting a settlement, not the content of the settlement. One of the objections to this analysis that you often hear is that that this officer or that officer is really radical and they're left wing, and of course this is often the case. Most of the time, most union officers are well to the left of most members, never mind most workers. They've often come from a union background, they often have a deep commitment to trade unionism, but that's the situation when you're talking about people's general views in society about the world and about the workplace and about trade unions. But when members are engaged in struggle, their ideas often change quite rapidly, particularly, but not just, on the issues connected with their fight. And it's very common when members are engaged in struggle, they find that the assumptions they'd made about their employer, about their colleagues, about wider society, about the media, about the law, about the state, you name it, get thrown into question, and people's experiences clash with the ideas that maybe they'd learnt at school or picked up from the media, and so on, and they can change their views extremely quickly. Whereas officers deal with industrial and political issues all their time, they tend to have more sophisticated ideas about those issues, and they tend to be more fixed, more set than those of members, so much less open to change in the course of struggle. So the result is that when particular groups of members are in struggle, they often find that they overtake officers who were previously far to the left of them, and they suddenly seem very conservative. So one of the phrases you'll hear people say is that officers find themselves balancing between, at any one time, a minority of members who may be engaged in struggle and are pushing for a more militant or radical approach, and maybe the majority of members, most of the time, who are not engaged in struggle and who are quite passive and so on. And the officer is trying to relate to both of those groups and straddle them and balancing between the two. Of course, when struggles get really big, and I'm not going to have time to go into some examples of this, the employment relationship itself is threatened, and that threatens the social role of union officers, whose role is mediating between workers and employers. And in all of those situations historically, union officers collectively, this isn't to say there aren't individuals who break from that, but collectively side with capital. And one of the phrases I quite like is, in the final analysis they betray, but in the meantime they vacillate. And by vacillate it means they wobble, they're unreliable, they flip-flop between pushing things forward and holding things back and so on. And I think that's very helpful. It gets us away from the thing you'll often hear from people on the left, that union officials always sell us out, which simply isn't true. And it allows us to understand that they're a mediating layer, they're under pressures from different sides, and the nature of the behaviour that leads to. So this slide is showing some examples of the sorts of behaviour that's common to find from union officers, and it would be interesting, if people are discussing this video, to think about which of those you've experienced, whether there are other patterns you've noticed, and so on. Now, of course, there's a big range of officer behaviour, and any analysis can only talk about general patterns. It's not like people have their brain removed the moment they take a job from the union. The longer people have been imposed, the more senior they're imposed, the more they're engaged with bargaining and so on, the greater the pressures are on them. And of course, similarly, the weaker the workplace organisation is, the less pressure there is from workers to hold those officers on the straight and narrow. But you can see some quite common features there which lead officers to behave in ways that frustrate workers who are engaged in struggle. So over the years, workers have tried to respond to this problem in a whole range of different ways, ignoring and bypassing officers, just thinking let's do things for ourselves, just blaming officers, denouncing them as outrageous sellouts, trying to replace officers with better ones, trying to change the rules and policies of the unions, setting up new unions or splitting from existing ones, or the final one there, which I would associate with what I would call the rank and file strategy, trying to work with and against those officers. And of course, some people just get disillusioned with their experience with the union officers and simply leave unions in frustration. So I want to look at each one of those approaches in turn and just look at some of the features of those responses and how they've worked for workers. So ignoring or bypassing officers obviously has a strength in that it builds self-reliant, self-activity, workers building their own power. But it has some serious problems as well in terms of denying you access to the benefits that having the union structure on your side and supporting you can give. And in particular, if you don't involve the officers, most members never get to see, experience and learn from the difficulties of dealing with those officers for themselves. So you can get a leadership in a particular workplace who adopt this approach, and the members don't really understand why that approach is being adopted, and haven't learnt for themselves some of the tensions that exist and the conflicts that exist within trade unions. And then, of course, if a struggle breaks beyond the scope of where that particular leadership can cope without the involvement of officers, it tends to hit a bit of a brick wall. Blaming officers, is understandable in some cases. It's at least partially right, but that doesn't really help overcome the problem. To most workers, you just appear anti-union. If you adopt this approach, you end up making it more difficult for yourself to build workplace organisation and involve people in the it's very common to want to replace bad officers with better ones, and why not? Clearly everybody wants the best officer they can get. But of course, if the causes are structural, even if the best militants became officers, they would still be subject to those same pressures and still risk letting you down in the same way as the ones we've had. So it's a strategy worth adopting, but it's not sufficient, I would argue. Similarly, improving the rules and policies of a union can help shift the balance of power, so it makes it easier for the rank and file to control and exert pressure over union officials. And there's a whole range of measures that people have taken over the years in order to do that, and those are all helpful, but again, they don't remove the problem. All they're doing is mitigating it, so they're well worth pursuing, but not sufficient in themselves. In terms of red unions and splits, there've been some really interesting examples, and for myself in Unite, it's interesting to see. One of the big splits in the labour movement in the 80s was the electricians union, the EETPU, being expelled from the TUC after it had organised scabbing against printers at Wapping. A minority of EETPU members left and set up the EPIU, which later became part of the Transport and General Workers Union, while the EETPU became part of the AWU, Amicus, and all of them have now ended up in Unite. Another good example was a rank and file network in the North Sea in the 80s called the OILC, the Offshore Industry Liaison Committee, ended up joining the RMT. So often these splits end up back in the mainstream unions at a later date. At the moment, we've got some tiny unions like United Voices of the World and the Industrial Workers of Great Britain doing some really good work, particularly organising precarious workers, undoubtedly helped by the fact that they lack any bureaucracy, and much more responsive and agile when it comes to dealing with particular groups of workers. Strong commitment to workplace democracy is really helpful. However, I think there are limitations with these approaches. So splits rarely take the bulk of members with them, and effectively leave most members at the mercy of the existing bureaucracy, but without the best people who've split being there to challenge and pressure that bureaucracy. So for the workforce as a whole, that can sometimes be quite counterproductive. And splits and new unions don't address the structural causes. If the tiny unions succeed and grow, they will reproduce the problems that the bigger unions already have. I think the smaller unions are doing some important work, and people should give solidarity to those and get involved if they're in those workplaces. But as a strategy for dealing with the bureaucracy, I don't think that's adequate, and I think the splits off major unions are usually unhelpful. So turning to the rank and file approach, and the classic statement of this came from the Clyde Workers' Committee in 1915. I'm not going to read it out, but a very important statement. And of course, this was during World War I, where official action was illegal. The unions themselves were not playing the normal role they did. In engineering in particular, you had a multi-union environment, and all of these factors encouraged a strong rank and file movement where workplace level democracy and organisation was required to fight back over the issues workers were facing. And what happened is those workplace level organisations started to join up, forming these workers' committees in major engineering centres to provide an alternative rank and file based leadership for workers' struggle. Very important example. And the statement contains a lot of wisdom and a lot we can learn from. Because you'll see it talks about supporting the officials so long as they rightly represent the workers and acting independently. So it's got those two concepts of both working with them and independently of them, not being dependent on them, and focusing on representing the true feelings of the workers, that democratic culture. One thing that I think is really important to recognise when we're talking about a rank and file approach is that the power of the rank and file in relation to the officers is, if you like, an echo of their power in relation to the employer. If in a workplace workers are weak, they feel dependent on the bureaucracy for support, for officers coming in and sorting out problems for them. And I think you can see this in converse with the recent experience in the UCU university strike, where the fact that the strike has been going so well, has been so well supported, such good levels of participation, had made the workers feel confident to stand up when the leadership wanted to introduce a deal that wasn't good enough in the eyes of the workforce. That could not have happened if there hadn't been that level of confidence and militancy in the struggle against the employer. It was a product of that struggle. And that has important implications for the ability to build rank and file organisation outside the context of struggle. It's when there's struggle that the biggest potential occurs. One of the pieces of language in that Clyde Workers' Committee that I always think is worth unpacking a little bit is that it talks about acting independently. And when they were talking about striking independently and unofficially. But I think we have to recognise that it's about more than just that everything that builds the capacity of workers to operate their own democracy, to take decisions, to act, to campaign without being reliant and dependent on the officials is about building the strength of workers and their capacity to assert their own agenda against both the employer and where they let us down against officials. So that's something that everybody can work on, even if they're not in a position where they're able to lead unofficial strikes like the Clyde Workers' Committee. Some more points about that rank and file strategy. It's not about setting up rival unions. It's about organising activists and members within and across unions, because it has to be centred on industrial issues, about challenging employers, not just about fighting internal battles within the union. So in industries where there are multiple unions, it has to attempt and aspire to reach across those union boundaries. And of course, a good rank and file strategy can include trying to improve rules and policies, replacing bad officials with better ones, and so on. It doesn't exclude those other approaches. Another key point is that notion of working with and against officials isn't about doing things at different times. Usually you're doing a bit of both. You're working with the officials to the extent that's possible, but you're also trying to build that independent capacity of workers to stand up for themselves against their employer, and to, as it says, the focus is on building independence, capacity and self-activity of workers, using the help from the union apparatus wherever possible. It's also worth recognising that the union bureaucracy isn't monolithic. The divisions within it are important. There will be differences between sectors, there'll be political differences, there'll be differences between top and bottom within the machine, there'll be individual differences between different officers who, the best officers encourage the development of rank and file organisation and welcome the pressure that the rank and file brings on them to help them stand up against the pressure they're under from employers. So this isn't about treating everybody who's a union official as if they're the enemy or as if they're all the same. And just to reiterate something I talked about earlier, we have to remain focused that the main conflict is between workers and employers and government. The one between the rank and file and bureaucracy is secondary, and I would argue that left-right divisions come third. They're less fundamental. So when there's a struggle in a workplace, you often find people who maybe politically have quite right-wing views, can be quite militant over those workplace issues and shift their opinion quite rapidly. And similarly, within the union bureaucracy, you find that the divisions between left and right shrink when there's big struggles going on. So when there's nothing happening, the left and right divisions can seem very, very important. When there's a lot happening, they're less so. One of the key features of this strategy is that building direct links with other activists is absolutely vital. That's how you build that capacity to support each other, to give solidarity, and provide independence of the official structures so that people can fight back against employers and can do so without being dependent on the approval of officials for particular things they're doing.